The champagne flute in Miriam's hand trembled just slightly. Not enough for anyone at the table to notice, but enough that she had to set it down before the crystal chimed against the plate and gave her away. The private dining room at Auberge du Pommier was the kind of place that made you lower your voice without being asked. Dark walnut panels, candlelight soft enough to hide the sharp edges of things. Her husband Elliot sat across from the Japanese investor, a measured silver-haired man named Mr. Kobayashi, and was speaking in Korean. Elliot had been living in Seoul for 3 years before they met. He'd told her once, early on, that it was the one language he felt most himself in. She had listened and nodded and said nothing about her own 2 years at Yonsei University, or the fact that she'd passed the TOEIC Level 6 exam the spring before they got engaged. She reached for her water glass instead. "She's decorative," Elliot was saying, with the easy confidence of a man who has never once been surprised by a woman. "Lovely at dinners, good with the wives. But she doesn't understand this world, she never really did." Mr. Kobayashi made a small sound. Not agreement, exactly. More the sound of a man choosing not to disagree. "The company is mine," Elliot continued. "She signed the prenuptial. She gets $30,000 and a flight home if we ever split." $30,000. He laughed quietly at his own cleverness. "I made sure of that." Miriam picked up her fork and cut a very small piece of the halibut on her plate. She chewed it slowly. She did not look up. Elliot kept talking. He talked about the Vancouver real estate holding company. The one he'd registered 6 months before their wedding. The one that now held 3 properties worth a combined $14 million. He talked about the IPO for his tech firm, Corlin Systems, which was scheduled for the following spring. He talked about how the timing was perfect, how the projections looked exceptional, how nothing was going to interrupt the momentum now. "And your assistant?" Mr. Kobayashi asked in Korean. "The one who has been managing the shareholder communications?" Elliot's expression shifted into something warmer, something private. "That's a separate matter. Not relevant to tonight." But it was said the way a man says something when it's very relevant indeed. Miriam took another sip of water. Her jaw was perfectly relaxed. She had spent years managing Elliot's dinner parties, his client receptions, his speaking events. She knew exactly what her face was supposed to look like when she wasn't paying attention to the conversation around her. She deployed that face now like a tool. Inside, her mind was turning at a different speed entirely. The assistant he was referring to was a woman named Dara Nielsen. Miriam knew the name. She'd seen it on the calendar, on receipts, on a hotel confirmation that had appeared, briefly, in the downloads folder of the shared laptop before Elliot had cleared the browser history. He hadn't cleared the downloads folder. She had never mentioned this to him. When the dinner finally ended, Elliot turned to her with the practiced warmth he used at events. Warm enough to look real, not so warm that it cost him anything. "You must be exhausted, love. Why don't you take the car? I'll get a cab when Kobayashi and I finish up." "Of course," she said, and kissed his cheek and gathered her wrap from the back of the chair. In Korean she said quietly to Mr. Kobayashi, "It was a genuine pleasure this evening. Please give my regards to your family in Osaka." The silence that followed was exquisite. Miriam walked out of Auberge du Pommier without looking back, but she heard Elliot's chair scrape against the floor, heard his voice drop to something urgent and confused, heard Kobayashi's careful, non-committal response. Outside, the November air off Lake Ontario came at her like a wall. She stood on the pavement and breathed it in, cold, clean, faintly metallic, and thought now. She didn't go to the Rosedale house. She drove to her sister's apartment in Leslieville instead, a third-floor walk-up above a Korean grocery that always smelled of dried anchovy and sesame, and she sat down at the kitchen table and told her sister Adeze. No, stop, wrong name from the list. She sat at the table and told her sister everything. Her sister's name was Kezia. She'd been a family lawyer for 11 years and had the particular stillness of someone who has heard worse and knows exactly what to do about it. Kezia didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she got up, filled 2 mugs of barley tea, set one in front of Miriam, and sat back down. "The prenup," Kezia said. "Do you remember the exact language around fidelity?" "I remember everything. Dad went over every line with me before I signed it. There was a clause. If Elliot was unfaithful, and Dad made them define it explicitly, not just romantic relationship, but any sustained intimate involvement, the prenuptial is void. I get 50% of all marital assets." Kezia wrapped both hands around her mug. "And the real estate holdings? Registered before the wedding. But I contributed the down payment on the annex property. I have the bank records. The money came from my account. How much? 80,000. Kezia looked at her steadily. "Miriam, that property is worth $4.6 million now." "I know." Another silence. The barley tea steamed between them. "We need to document the affair before we do anything else," Kezia said. Not suspicion. Documentation. Do you have access to his accounts? He asked me to memorize his passwords 4 years ago so I could manage the household accounts when he was traveling. He's never changed them. He assumed I wouldn't know what to do with them. Kezia almost smiled. It wasn't a happy smile, but it was a real one. Okay, here's what we're going to do. They talked until 2 in the morning. Kezia knew a forensic accountant, a former colleague who had worked on 3 major divorce cases in the past year. She also knew a family law barrister at a firm in the financial district, a woman named Rosario Lim, who was, in Kezia's words, the person you want standing next to you when the other side shows up with lawyers. Don't confront him, Kezia said at the door when Miriam was putting on her coat. Don't change anything. Go home, be exactly who he thinks you are, and give me 72 hours. Miriam drove back to Rosedale at 2:30 in the morning. Elliot's car was in the driveway. She let herself in quietly, changed in the guest bathroom, and got into bed beside a sleeping husband who had no idea that the version of his wife he had invented was already gone. Over the following 3 weeks she gathered everything. The passwords held. His email was an archive of carelessness, hotel bookings, restaurant reservations, a thread with Dara Nielsen that was businesslike on the surface and then, suddenly not. She photographed everything with her phone, transferred copies to an encrypted folder, and sent duplicates to Kezia's secure email address every evening. She accessed the corporate accounts for Corland Systems. Through the login she'd used during the years she'd handled Elliot's travel bookings. What she found there took her longer to understand. Consulting fees paid to a numbered company in Alberta. Marketing contracts with firms she couldn't trace. She forwarded everything to Kezia, who sent it to the forensic accountant. Rosario Lim called her 4 days later. The prenuptial is void the moment we establish infidelity, which the documentation you've provided already does, Rosario said. But more importantly, those Alberta contracts. The numbered company traces back to a property management firm incorporated in Dara Nielsen's mother's name. Your husband has been routing company expenses through a shell connected to his girlfriend. That's not just a conflict of interest. That's fraud. Miriam was sitting in her car in the parking lot of the Leaside Library, where she'd started spending her afternoons. She pressed her back against the seat. What does that mean for the IPO? She asked. It means we have leverage that goes far beyond a standard divorce settlement, Rosario said. If we file now and this comes out during discovery, it kills the IPO and potentially triggers a securities investigation. But if we time this correctly, if we wait until just after the IPO closes, the share price will be public record. Your portion of the marital estate will be at peak value, and he won't be able to hide or deflate the company's worth. How long? The IPO is scheduled for March. 4 months. Miriam stared at a woman outside the library pushing a stroller through a pile of yellow leaves. 4 months of pretending nothing has changed. 4 months of building the most airtight case he's ever seen. She thought about it. She thought about the dinner table in Rosedale, where Elliot sat at the head and talked about the company and asked her, occasionally, what she'd done with her day. She thought about the version of herself she'd been performing for 6 years. She was tired of the performance, but she understood what Rosario was telling her. Anger was expensive. Patience was an asset. All right, she said. 4 months. The winter passed in 2 layers. On the surface, she was the same. She attended the Corland Systems holiday reception at the Fairmont Royal York, and stood next to Elliot while he worked the room, and she smiled at the right moments, and refilled her champagne at measured intervals, and said nothing in Korean to anyone. She went to the board meetings of the community literacy organization she'd been running for 3 years. The one Elliot described to people as her little book project. The one that had actually placed over 400 adults in employment programs, through its financial literacy curriculum. Underneath, she was building. She moved money from the joint accounts in careful increments. Home improvement expenses, donations to the literacy organization, investment contributions, all documented, all legal, all hers. She registered a consulting practice under her maiden name, Miriam Osi Agumang Consulting. She had 2 clients within a month, referrals from contacts she'd made over years of showing up to events and actually listening to people. A mid-size investment firm in Waterloo wanted help developing their community partnership strategy. A property developer in Kitchener wanted someone to manage their stakeholder engagement process. She said yes to both. She started spending Tuesday and Thursday afternoons at a shared office space in the West End, where no one knew her as Mrs. Elliot Hargrove and where she could sit in front of her own laptop and do actual work. One Tuesday in January, she came home to find that Elliot had left the Corland Systems laptop open on the kitchen island. A notification had come through, an internal message from his CFO. She read it without touching the keyboard. the quarterly projections had been adjusted. Not by a small amount. The revenue figures listed in the draft investor disclosure were significantly higher than the actual figures she'd seen in the forensic accountant's analysis. She photographed the screen. That evening she sent the images to Rosario with a note. "I think there may be more here than just the Alberta contracts." Rosario called back within the hour. "This is material misrepresentation to investors. If Corland goes public on these numbers and they don't reflect reality, we're looking at a securities fraud issue. The Ontario Securities Commission will be very interested. Does this change our timeline? It gives us more options. We can hold it, or we can use it as leverage. Either way, you're in a stronger position than you were this morning." Miriam thanked her and hung up and made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen island where the laptop had been and thought about the version of herself who had stood at an altar 6 years ago and believed, genuinely, that she was building something. She wasn't angry anymore. She had moved through anger in November, in the first cold week after the dinner, and what had replaced it was something she didn't have a word for. It wasn't peace. It was something more purposeful. A kind of clear-eyed focus that felt, if she was honest, like a version of herself she had forgotten existed. The literacy organization held its annual fundraising gala in February. Miriam had organized it herself, the venue, the catering, the speakers, the sponsorship packages. Elliot came because she'd asked him to, and he stood near the bar looking vaguely magnanimous while Miriam worked the room. A man named Foster Oduya approached her near the end of the evening. He was the regional director of a national workforce development fund, and he'd been watching her manage the event. "You ran this whole thing," he said. "It wasn't a question." "The organization did," she said. "I've been on a board for 20 years, he said. "I can tell who runs things." "I wanted to ask, have you considered doing this professionally? The stakeholder engagement, the community investment strategy. We're looking for someone to head up our Ontario Advisory Committee. It's not a small role." She took his card. She thought, in 4 months. The IPO was announced for March 18th. By the first week of March, Rosario had everything prepared. The divorce filing, the evidence of the affair, the documentation of the Alberta Shell Company, the financial misrepresentation materials. They were waiting for the close of the first trading day. The night before she planned to leave, Miriam sat in the study that had been hers in name only, the one with the built-in shelves she'd filled with books Elliot never touched, and wrote down every account number, every password, every holding, every detail she might need in the weeks ahead. She'd been keeping the list encrypted on her phone for months, but there was something she needed about writing it by hand, making it concrete, making it real. Elliot came home late, smelling of a restaurant she recognized as one he went to when he wanted to be seen. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been managing a great deal and didn't enjoy the effort. "Big week," he said, loosening his tie in the doorway of the study. "I know," she said. "After the IPO closes, maybe we'll go somewhere. Take a break, you've been patient." She looked at him. He meant it, in whatever way he was capable of meaning things. "I have been," she said. "You're right about that." The stock opened on a Thursday morning. By 11 it was trading above the offering price. By close, Corland Systems had a market cap that placed Miriam's portion of the marital estate, including the voided prenuptial and her claim to the annex property, at somewhere between $38 and $42 million, depending on the date of final valuation. Rosario filed the papers at 4:15 that afternoon. Elliot was served at the Corland offices at 5:30, in front of his assistant and 2 members of his board. Miriam was already in a hotel room on the 14th floor of a building on Wellington Street, looking out over the lake. She'd packed the bag 3 weeks ago. She'd checked in under Osi Agumang, her mother's name, the name she'd grown up with. The room was quiet. She ordered room service, the mushroom soup and a glass of Riesling, and called Kezia. "It's done," she said. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I've been holding my breath for 4 months and just exhaled." "That's about right," Kezia said. "Rosario says his lawyers are already calling. They want to negotiate. He can negotiate with Rosario. That's what she's there for." Elliot tried to reach her through 3 different phone numbers that evening. She blocked each one as it came through. The texts that arrived before she'd blocked them were a predictable arc: confusion, then argument, then a softening that was supposed to look like remorse. She read them the way she'd once read case studies, clinically, with interest but without investment. His legal team filed a counter-motion 2 days later, arguing that she had deceived him, had gathered information through unauthorized access, had engineered the entire sequence of events in bad faith. It was a good attempt. It didn't hold up. Every account she had accessed was one she held legal access to. Every document she had copied was from a system she was authorized to use. Rosario met each argument with documentation and the particular calm of someone who has done this many times before. At the first hearing, Elliot arrived with 4 lawyers. He looked like himself, composed, pressed shirt, the kind of confident that performs well in rooms like this. But Miriam had spent 6 years watching him in rooms like this, and she could see the difference now. The confidence was load-bearing. It needed the room to cooperate with it. This room did not cooperate. The judge reviewed the fraud documentation and the prenuptial clause and set a date for the full hearing. Your husband's team is going to argue the prenuptial was valid, Rosario told her afterward in the hallway. They'll claim the infidelity clause wasn't triggered because the relationship with Ms. Nielsen was professional. They have emails, Miriam said. We have emails, Rosario agreed. We also have the Alberta Shell Company, which his legal team has not yet figured out how to explain. Once the OSC opens an inquiry, and they will, because I sent them the disclosure documents, his team is going to be managing 2 separate fires. They're not going to have the bandwidth to fight us on the prenuptial language. It went exactly as Rosario had predicted. The Ontario Securities Commission opened a formal inquiry into Corlin Systems 6 weeks after the IPO. Elliot was removed as CEO pending the investigation. The share price dropped. His legal team's attention fractured. In the settlement that followed, Miriam received her 40% stake in the marital assets, just under $39 million at final valuation, plus the court's recognition of her founding contribution to the annex property, which added another $4.2 million. The prenuptial was voided. She walked out of the courthouse on a Tuesday in June, and the air smelled like linden flowers from the trees along University Avenue, and Kezia was standing at the bottom of the steps holding 2 coffees. Come on, Kezia said. I know a place. They walked to a patio on Queen Street and sat in the afternoon sun, and Miriam drank her coffee and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the chair beneath her was hers. Not borrowed, not conditional. Hers. She called Foster Oduya the following week and told him she was available. The advisory committee role led to a contract, and the contract led to 3 referrals, and by September, Miriam O.C. Aguimon Consulting had a lease on a proper office in Liberty Village and a team of 4. She took on the work she had always been capable of: community investment strategy, stakeholder engagement, corporate governance consulting for organizations that wanted to do things differently. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She had just spent 6 years doing it for free, for a man who described it to dinner guests as her hobby. The literacy organization promoted her from volunteer board member to paid strategic director. She accepted. She developed a financial empowerment curriculum that was adopted by 2 school boards in the GTA. She began getting invited to speak at conferences: women in business, ethical leadership, community investment. She did not talk publicly about the divorce. That was hers. But she talked about everything adjacent to it: what it meant to spend years diminishing yourself and what it felt like to stop. Audiences always knew what she was really talking about. That was the point. In November, exactly 1 year after the dinner at Auberge du Pommier, she sat at her own desk in her own office and looked out at the street below. It was cold. The last of the leaves were coming down in the wind off the lake, the particular gray gold of a Toronto November. And she had 4 meetings on her calendar and a proposal due and a call with Foster's team about expanding the program into southwestern Ontario. A notification came through on her phone, a news alert. Corlin Systems CFO cooperates with OSC in fraud investigation. Former CEO Hargrove, named in civil suit by shareholders. She read it once, then she put her phone face down on the desk and went back to her proposal. There was a knock at the door. Her office manager, a sharp-eyed young woman named Petra, leaned in. Your 2 o'clock is here, and you have a message from a Takahashi Holdings. They want to know if you'd be available for a project consultation, something about bridging their Canadian subsidiary with their Tokyo office. Miriam looked up from her screen. Tell them yes, she said, and tell them I'm available to speak in Korean if it's more comfortable. Petra blinked. You speak Korean? I passed the level 6 exam, Miriam said. I've just never had much occasion to mention it. She saved her document and stood up and straightened her jacket, and walked out to meet whoever was waiting.